Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the inaugural IRMS Public Sector webinar. My name's Sarah Graham and I work as the Secretary for the Public Sector Group. Our chairperson is Elizabeth Barber. Unfortunately, Elizabeth can't make it today, but she sends her best wishes for the session. So hope you all enjoy it. What we have here is we have Robert Bath, who's our resident expert on MS Teams. So he's going to take us through a few interesting points of note with regards to records and governance in Microsoft Teams. So that'll be very useful. And the way we're going to work it is Rob's going to go through his slides and there'll be opportunities to ask questions at the end. In addition, if you look on your right-hand side, you'll see that there's 4 sections. There's a chat section, so you can have general chit-chat, and I can see lots of people are saying hi and that, which is perfect. That's exactly what it's for. There's a section on questions. So if you've got a specific question about MS Teams or something about IRMS, myself and Rob will do our best to answer those questions. In the 3rd section, there is a poll, and I'd really like it if people could fill that in. You can understand what we're driving at here. We're just trying to get a feel of who is attending the webinar, who would maybe like more information about the RMS. And then you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a people function where you can see who's actually logged on the webinar. What happens is, because I'm an administrator, I can see the people in the full email, but members on Teams, as you all are, we'll just see the names, so we can go from there. We'll keep a record of all the questions because we're conscious that this is a very, very popular webinar. We've had 215 registrations, so it's hugely popular. So we're conscious that we may not get to all the questions that you pose. If we don't, we're going to make a record of those in true records management style, of course. We're going to make a record of that, and Rob has very kindly offered to do a blog post to answer the questions that we don't get to at the end. So there we go. Basically, if you have any queries, please just pop in that questions list and I'll get to you ASAP. I can see that Colin has asked a question here. He's saying, can we get a copy of the presentation at the end? I'm sure Rob will be happy to provide that after the session, so I'm sure that will be absolutely fine. I'll type a quick response to that in the questions tab. So without further ado, I will pass over to Rob and we can talk about records and governance in Microsoft Teams.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me. I can see that the attendees, there's already north of 150 people on this call, and the number keeps growing as I speak. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Rob Bath. I'm a Microsoft 365. I'm getting it right. I would have said Office 365 only a month or so ago. I'm Microsoft 365 solution architect, and I've done nothing but SharePoint and Office 365, Microsoft 365 for the last, gosh, more than a decade. Effectively, I'm also, I'll put my cards on the table, I'm also affiliated with the IRMS. I'm about to step up as their digital director as well. So I'm biased, but I will just suggest that for anyone who isn't a member, I recognise there's a whole bunch of people who are members today listening in, and also a large number of people who aren't yet members of the IRMS. The IRMS really is, in my opinion, the best value organisation there is out there in the information governance community. The quality of the regular meetings they provide face-to-face right across the UK, and also the regular in-house bulletin magazine. Honestly, the value is second to none. So if you're not yet a member, I really would urge you to take a look at joining up. It's great value for money. Right. Objective today, I'm going to introduce Teams. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Teams, and just take you through how to actually govern and retain content inside Teams. I guess the reason for this this webinar at this point in time, and I guess the reason why there's so many people actively listening in, is because Teams has seen phenomenal growth. At the turn of the year, we had, I guess Microsoft are reporting something like 30 million active users using Microsoft Teams. And that's grown by last month to 72 million users around the world. And we all know the reason for why Teams is exponentially growing, but what we've seen then is effectively the collaboration and communication functionality that's provided by Teams really is taking off, and it's great. Users love it. But from a information compliance perspective, what you're seeing is an awful lot of usage of Teams, an awful lot of information that's being stored in Teams. And I guess many of us that are listening in on this call are all starting to think, oh gosh, how on earth am I going to make sure that information is effectively managed? It's getting in there, it's being used. How do we actually impose some controls upon it? So, what is Teams? Well, that feels awkward, doesn't it? Should I say what are Teams? What is Teams? I don't know. Teams effectively is a combination of communication features and collaboration features. So you're sort of seeing a merge of video calls and instant chats in with the collaboration functionality that you see in terms of the ability for a group of people, whether it's a project team or a physical team like a department, to actually just work together on content such as documents and also integrated team chat. But I guess I find it quite useful to look back at a sort of hypothetical, my view of where Teams came from in order to understand quite where it is now. So some of this, especially on this slide, is me postulating, me guessing almost the conversations that happened inside Microsoft. But it's clear to me that Teams started off really as a thinking process in the Exchange team. So it wasn't really coming from the communication side of this or from the SharePoint side of this. It was very much, I think, early on an Exchange endeavor. And what I believe, and Microsoft will probably shoot me for suggesting such, but while the issue of storing tons of emails and attachments was effectively the responsibility of every organization out there, I guess the Exchange team never really had any concerns about the volume of information that was being stored inside Exchange. But when that started to be brought in-house into Office 365, you can imagine that the gigabytes that were in each organization are now being pulled together into petabytes of a headache for Microsoft. So I can imagine a conversation happening in the Exchange team of how do we sort of encourage people to store less email, especially when we're talking about attachments, because if you've got an attachment on an email, and if you are sharing that attachment, well, let's say you send an email to 20 people, that's 20 copies of that attachment that's being stored now unnecessarily inside your organization. So Teams originally, I feel, was, when the first concept came around, the Exchange team was saying, wouldn't it be great if we could just get a single copy of this attachment and store it somewhere so that all of the people, instead of having to have their own separate versions being attached, can use one shared integrated version. And they looked around and thought, well, do we have somewhere to store our documents anywhere? Well, yes, you do. You've already got SharePoint. Now, originally it was OneDrive, but that's essentially SharePoint when you scratch the surface and look under the hood. But they realized if we can just integrate our attachments into SharePoint and use that as a storage mechanism, our problem's solved, isn't it? Sort of. Because, of course, SharePoint has a different permissions model. How do you make sure that the attachment that you've got on your email chain in Exchange is only shared with the people that you want to share the document with? Well, this sort of led, I believe, to the development of a new permission authentication structure within Office 365. At the time, it was called the Office 365 Group. Who knows if that's now the Microsoft 365 Group? I'm just going to call it the group. This effectively provided the members with access to not just the Exchange inbox and the Exchange calendar for that particular group, but also gave them access to the SharePoint files that were related to that group. So it gave them a one sort of membership, one authentication section to give you access to multiple different functions, and almost became the start of a digital workplace. Now, I can imagine the conversation inside Microsoft started sort of evolving slightly further and suggesting, hey, what other functions can we bring into this sort of shared authentication model to start unifying the way that people work into a single mechanism? Well, we've also got this other bit of the legacy functionality, all of our telephony, all of our conversations, video calls and chats in Skype for Business. If we could bring those together with this new group model, perhaps we could have the members of the group having their own private chat that's persistent between each other. And I think that's really where Teams has come from. You can see today, all of the legacy functionality that's come from different parts of Office 365 is really integrated into the Teams model. And this is continuing to this day. Very recently, we've seen Yammer communities being introduced, which is effectively pulling functionality in from Yammer. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate this. Teams now is its own beast in its own right, and it hasn't completely taken away from all of these different pieces of functionality, but it's certainly improved upon some of them, and in the case of Skype for Business, it's clearly superseded the functionality. But today I really want to drill in on the teams themselves, this button of teams I've highlighted on the left-hand side of the page, because I think it's important to make sure that everyone has a feel for teams. It's a bit confusing because what you're looking at here is a part of Microsoft Teams that is called Teams. And inside the part of Microsoft Teams that's called Teams, what do you find? Well, these things. These are teams inside the Teams area of Microsoft Teams. I really wish that Microsoft had come up with a different word for this because, you know, personally, I find it really difficult to explain what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a team or teams. Anyway, you can see here Project Alpha, COVID response, the finance department, just examples that I've made up of different typical sorts of teams that you might expect to see in an organization. And each team itself is made up of a series of channels. And each of those channels is effectively a subset of the team. So you can imagine a team is something like a project, and inside you can see here I've got an example project with channels that say things like project reports, research and development, etc., that's relating to that project. To keep all of the parts of the project, or parts, you can imagine this in the context of the department, the separate sort of themes separated into each channel within the team. And what's important about each of these channels is that effectively they're the place where you get this functionality at the top here, the posts and the files. And you've got other things like wiki, and you can bolt on other tabs as you see fit. But posts and files, I think, really are the sort of backbone, if you like, of each of the channels. So you've got the posts, and inside posts, very much this is a wall, a bit like Facebook, a conversation where you can have a persistent conversation just in that channel, and it stays there. So you can go back months later to have a look and see all of the conversation that's happened in that channel. You've also got files. And effectively, these files are stored in a SharePoint site that's related to the team. They're actually, technically, each channel is a folder inside a single document library inside a site that is related to the team. But you do have, as you can imagine, and as I'm sure many of you have used, the ability to store files inside your teams. And this is really where we're seeing a lot of sort of information management concern and headache. One thing, just as an aside, some of you will have heard of the concept of private channels, and it's indeed these channels that you can see along the side. You can quite happily have private channels in and amongst them. I'm not going to go into too much details on private channels today, but you can imagine our Project Alpha here might well have something that's, let's say, project finances or something that you don't want to share with all the members of that particular team. So you can have a channel inside a team with a subset of the members as the only people that can actually see the content inside that area and collaborate on the content in that area. Technically under the hood, it's actually spinning up an extra SharePoint site, which does add a little bit to the complexity of the architecture when you are using private channels. Now, just to carry on giving you an introduction to teams, there's actually 3 different types of teams that you've got available to you. But almost all of the teams you probably are using in your organization are probably private teams. Let me explain. So there's a concept of an org-wide team, and this effectively allows everyone in your organization to not just see, but also edit content within the team. So it's capped out at a maximum of 5,000 users, so it's only really for small and medium-sized organizations to use. But the thing to see this as is it's really for cross-organization sharing of knowledge and information, but because everyone can not just view it, it's not like an intranet replacement, it's much more sort of a collaboration space. But simply because everyone can edit this information, I don't think it gets, it might be used in some organizations quite successfully, but the majority of organizations I've worked in, I've not really seen too much usage of org-wide teams. You've also got public teams. Now, public teams, effectively anyone in the organization can see the team, and anyone in the organization can add themselves into the team or take themselves out of the team. So it's almost like an opt-in, opt-out sort of flexible team. It's really good for the sort of things where you don't mind if people opt in and opt out of a team, such as, I don't know, social committees or groups or sort of informal exchange of information. But you can imagine the larger the organization is, the more confusing this is to have multiple different public teams. They make less and less sense. So certainly when you're talking about enterprise organizations with tens of thousands of people, you rarely see public teams in use. Last but not least is the private team. And effectively what you've got here is each team has, the owner of the team is responsible really for populating the membership of the team. There's two types of private team. So you've got discoverable and non-discoverable private teams. Now, discoverable private teams pretty much means that when anyone in the organization can search, and they will be able to find that team, they'll be able to see its name, and they will be able to request access to join that team. It's down to the team owner as to whether or not they approve that request. Whereas a non-discoverable team, well, effectively that's super secret squirrel. No one can find it, no one can see it. The only way you can get access to it is if the owner of the team pulls you in. Right. So Teams has a really simple permissions model. There's nothing really complicated going on when you look behind the scenes. In fact, it's so simple that I personally feel it could almost do with a little bit more flexibility. But there's two types of permissions that you get in Teams. There's only two permission levels. You're either an owner, in which case you've got pretty much complete control over everything that happens in that team. Effectively, in the way I look at it, is that an owner is really the full administrator of that team. They can do pretty much anything with it. And there's also members. Now, members have the ability to edit anything and delete pretty much anything in that team. So to a certain extent, certainly all documents, all files, members can add, edit, delete. That's pretty empowering. The thing to point out here is there is no concept within Microsoft Teams of read-only at all. There's also no division between the owners and, I guess, sort of top-level IT administrators that you might see in other parts of your real estate. But what's interesting to me is the way these groups inside Teams, these membership permission groups, are mapped into SharePoint. Because what you see is that the owners of a team are actually given site collection administrator rights inside the SharePoint site where the files are stored behind the team. And the members are given membership of the members group. Gosh, that's a tongue twister as well. Now, to me, there's a couple of points here. Firstly, it's a bit interesting that the owners are not granted owner rights as opposed to the full admin control over the site. This means that within Teams, your owners of a team really are quite empowered. They can do anything pretty much inside that particular space in SharePoint. Likewise, the members are granted the ability to not just add, edit, and delete files, but if you, for example, created new lists and libraries inside the SharePoint site that's associated with the team, the members of your team can also delete the entire new list or library. So, yeah, it's pretty empowering, and sometimes I would suggest considering how much power Teams gives users in the SharePoint site. Certainly, that might have implications for the way that we maybe not use Teams, but the way we consider Teams as within the organization, as in what is it suitable for, given that members are really empowered with the permissions that they have over the content that's stored inside that team. Okay, slightly more boring slide, but I think it's, from my point of view, Teams really don't have they're sort of isolated, they're sort of quite stranded. There's no hierarchy of teams. And from an IT administrative point of view, there's no easy way of determining which team belongs to which part of the organization. Effectively in Teams, you've got your owners, you can see who owns the team, but if your organization is anything like the organizations I work in, from month to month, people change role, people leave the organization, and very quickly it's often difficult to work out which part of your organization, which department, which division, which business unit actually owns specific teams. And I personally feel this is a problem that just gets bigger and bigger the more teams you create. So the best solution I can see to this problem is making sure that you have some form of consistency, certainly in the naming of the teams and the groups behind them, so that when you actually create new teams, you are making sure that part of the name of the team is determining which part of your organization owns or is responsible for the content in that team. You can all imagine from a governance perspective, I think this is really going to start helping to give a sort of vague level of at least control or ability to go back to owners and start getting more information. I've also got a second bullet point here about purpose and type and value. I think getting some form of context of, let's say, whether this team represents a project or whether it represents a department or a committee or whatever in your organization, I think it's really useful to understand the context from when you're making decisions about how useful is this team. And potentially, I wouldn't always put this in the naming convention, but potentially you might consider having this as part of the name of the team as well. Now, Microsoft have recognized that getting naming conventions into teams would be a pretty useful thing to do, and they provide something called a groups naming policy. If you happen to be lucky enough to have an Azure Active Directory Premium P1 license, or various other licenses, like I think there's an EDU, basic EDU license or something. But effectively, this groups naming policy provides an automatic way of just appending to the name of your team or the name of your workspace. So what you can do is effectively you can add a prefix or a suffix, and you can choose to add fixed words that are sort of fixed across your entire organization, which is fine, but not particularly useful, because really it's not what you're really after, trying to determine what makes each team unique or different as opposed to what makes them similar. Or you can take attributes from Active Directory, which really is, I think, quite a useful way of starting to pull things like department, let's say, or company out of AD and actually appending that into the name of your workspace to get more consistency. You can also have some control over the actual name of the team itself, over the name of the workspace. So you can block certain keywords, etc. But I guess this isn't the only way of doing this. It works perfectly well for some organizations, and it's a great piece of kit using the groups naming policy that Microsoft provide. But there's another alternative, and that I think is perhaps more useful for many organizations, and that's really to control the whole process of creating new teams, so that you are, we'll come to this later, but handling requests and approving the creation of the team. And at that point, you can also consider appending prefixes, etc., to get the extra bits of information in that's essential. So we'll come back to that. Teams, I'm mentioning this bit of functionality because I think it's really interesting for information compliance experts and specialists to be aware of, is that Teams has the ability to have auto expiration or a group expiration policy applied. And what this does is it basically is an auto deletion tool that just gets rid of your old teams. Now, I can see there being some context where this is really useful, and certainly if I put my IT thinking hat on, this is great because you get rid of loads of things that people aren't using. But you can probably imagine from a compliance and governance perspective that actually, just because it's not actively being used right now doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have value to the organization. A great example I can imagine is, the example I always use is someone drills through the walls and hits some asbestos. If your team contains information relating to that, no one's going to be viewing it on a regular basis. But in 50 years' time, when someone comes back with a lung condition, the fact that your team was auto-deleted and you lost all that information would be pretty critical. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting you store that sort of information in Teams. You might choose to. But when it comes to team expiration, the way it works is effectively teams will be, you set a time period and teams will be automatically deleted down if content in the team isn't being used, if things aren't being viewed, etc. And what happens is the owners of the team are and sent a notification to say, hey, in X number of days, this team is going to be deleted. And if they don't respond, if they don't renew the team, then it does indeed get deleted down. And you've got about 30 days to recover it before it's fully hard deleted. I wouldn't suggest this is going to be a primary thing you use in your governance of Microsoft Teams, but at the same time, I can imagine that many people in information management are going to find themselves in conversations with their IT department who are going to be saying things like, this is a great tool, it just helps us get rid of all the stuff. Just be aware that it exists. There's also a cool function in Teams called archival, which allows you to effectively take a team and what Microsoft call archive it. Really, it's just hiding it from the navigation and stripping permissions off the team, so it's making it a read-only team. So it's sort of, you can, as a user, I'd still be able to search and find the team. I'd still be able to discover the content of the team. It's all just read-only. It's all just hidden behind the scenes. It's quite useful, but as you can imagine, it's not really moving it to an archive. It's really keeping it in situ and sort of closing it down. I think it could be really useful for many organizations to take advantage of. You can imagine how this works. Once you've archived a team, you can see here this project Epsilon has been archived. You've also got the ability to restore it at a later point in time. So it really is like an on-off switch. It's not a permanent archive, and I don't think it should be considered as such. It's very useful, though, to get rid of the clutter of teams in your left navigation, to reduce it to just the ones that are active and allow you to sort of deprecate teams that are no longer being used on a daily basis. Okay, so I guess what many of you are here to listen into is about the retention aspects of teams. Now, if we go back to the earlier slide where we're looking at sort of Skype for Business components and also SharePoint components, I think the legacy that we saw from the history of how Teams was developed really comes to fore in the way that the retention functionality works in Teams. You see the chat and post that originally came from Skype for Business and are now clearly part of Teams, you can govern retention using retention policies in those areas. Whereas the files areas, you effectively can only, I've missed an eye on policies there, haven't I? Oh, that's great. But anyway, the files area of Teams, effectively you can make use of retention labels or retention policies. So you've got much more control over the files simply because they're stored in SharePoint than you do over the posts and chat. So let me dive into a bit more detail just to explain the difference. So, how do you apply retention? Well, within chats and posts using retention policies, the keyword here is all. It's a really high level, it's a really broad brush approach to retention. So effectively, you're applying it to everything in the team, all the posts in the team, or all of the chats by an individual person. So you can't pick and choose and just say, no, just this channel, or just the relevant chats. It's very much a big, broad brush approach to applying retention. With files, retention, you're assuming that you're using retention labels as opposed to retention policies with files, but with retention labels on your files, effectively you've got a lot more, far more options. You can obviously manually tag different files with different labels. Now, we all know that no one actually tags their content when asked, but it certainly gives you the ability to get right down to that low level of fidelity so that every single document, every single PDF can have a separate tag applied to it, a separate label if needed. More usefully, I think, you've got the ability to set default values. Now, default values can be set on structural areas. So, for example, you could say, take the entirety of a channel and set a different default label from a different channel inside the same team. And that basically means that all of the content that gets added into that particular channel would get a different default retention label applied to it. So you can imagine you could apply a different label for your project finance from, let's say, your project reports. You could also use some automated features for retention labels, and I think this is great. There's some really powerful tools if you happen to be lucky enough to have a premium license. I'm not going to list them all because it used to just be E5 plus, but now there's a whole range of, I'd be here for forever explaining all the different licenses. I wrote it all out in a recent blog post I posted on Intelogy's website. But, automatically, you've got the option of, basically there's 3 different ways you can automatically apply retention labels to files. You could match phrases. So if you happen to have a type of file that has a consistent phrase in it, consistent terms or keywords, you could find all of those irrespective of the team or SharePoint site or wherever they happen to be located and basically apply consistent labels to them. You've also got a concept called sensitive information types, which is really cool because effectively what it does is it allows you to find things like PII such as passport numbers or things like credit card numbers. And again, automatically apply that across all of your different files in different teams. And the third one is more recent. It's a concept called trainable classifiers, which I really need to sort of play with a little bit more myself. But effectively, it's AI-driven application of retention labels. And what you do is you train with about 50 or 60 files. You train the AI to recognize the similar type of files. Let's say you give it 50 examples of policies. Every time it sees something that the AI then is convinced looks and smells like a policy, it will stamp that label to it. So you've got a lot more control, as you can see, over application of retention on the file side of Teams than you do on the chat or post side of Teams. The starting point of retention, you've got 2 options with chats and posts: when the actual chat or post was first created, or when it was last changed. And I think the last change is quite an interesting point. Many of you might not have realized this, but if you go to a Microsoft team and go to the messages that are up on the wall, if you like, of the team, of the posts, you can, in any of those channels, you can edit your own posts. You can change the comments you made. And of course, that would restart the retention period if that's what you're using as the starting point. On the file side, however, you've got the same two options, but you've also got two additional options. You can start retention on files at the point in time when the file is labeled, or really interesting to me, this based on an event. So I'm about to get a blog post up on my company's website fairly soon, but effectively event-driven retention has been around for a couple of years now, and it's really cool. You basically can have chain up things, let's say the end of a project, and trigger at the end of a project the start of retention for all of the files that happen to be related to that project, irrespective of where they're stored, so long as they've been classified as being related to the given project. So really powerful, but not perfect in every scenario. During retention, while in the middle of a retention period, a chat or post can continue to be edited. There's no limitation on how many times it can be changed. And likewise, as a user, I can delete my own chats. They're caught behind the scenes by the retention policy. So effectively, there's a separate bucket that's hidden from users that just catches that. And as an information manager, you can get into that bucket and interrogate and see what's being caught behind the scenes. With files, again, you get more options with retention labels. So you've got an option, I don't think it's perfect, but you've got an option of basically making files immutable. So you can lock them down and prevent changes to the file itself, if not to the metadata of the file. And it's a bit limited in the way it's applied, but at least you've got the ability to potentially make things genuinely into records when you're talking about files, which you can't do in chats and posts. You've also got the ability to, prevent altogether the files from being deleted. Now, this is a double-edged sword because while it actually, instead of catching it behind the scenes, it actually prevents end users from deleting the file. It pops up with a little message in the corner and says, sorry, you can't file this, you can't delete this file because it's currently has a retention label applied to it. I guess the keyword is while labeled. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from taking the label off and deleting the file, so it's not perfect, certainly. Very often when we're talking about files, I would use a combination of both retention labels and retention policies. Retention labels is the default to catch most things. Retention policies more as sort of a safety net to catch the things that have more intentionally been deleted against the flow, shall I say. And then there's some differences at the end of retention as well. With retention policies in chats and posts, you have two options. You either delete the content automatically when it gets to the end of the retention period, or do nothing, which I've no idea why you'd ever choose that option. So you can see there really aren't many options at all with what you do at the end of retention. You've got a bit more control with files because you can actually make each file subject to a disposition review. And I say each file because there's no concept of aggregations yet, but effectively you can at least have a third option where you can make an informed choice over the value of and the context of the information before it's deleted. Notice in both of these options, there's no word saying archive or export or anything else. You can obviously extend retention, etc., but there's only a handful of options that you've got there. Okay. Moving on. Now, I'm not going to dwell too heavily into sensitivity, but I just wanted to mention that there's some really cool things that you've got available to you over in the sort of more security side of teams. So this is all coming from the compliance center and the security center, but you've got concepts like data loss prevention and sensitivity labels, which if you haven't looked at them, I'd suggest having a poke around and investigating, because you can do some really cool things. So let me just give you some examples of what you do. It's really about stopping data from leaking out into the of your organization, or leaking out inside your organization to get into the hands of the wrong people inside your organization. It's also about imposing controls or limits about how that information is used. So for example, with DLP, you can actually physically prevent someone from sending an email, let's say with an attachment, or posting a message to send someone who's not allowed to receive a certain file in the first place. And with sensitivity labels, you've got the ability to then impose controls to prevent that, let's say, people outside your organization from, I don't know, printing or downloading specific files. But in the context of teams, some examples would include, with data loss prevention, you can automatically hide messages and chats that contain sensitive information. So for example, if someone goes to the wall of a channel and starts posting in, I don't know, a credit card number, you can automatically block that if you've set this up. So it just says, no, sorry, you're not allowed to share that sort of sensitive information in this context. And with sensitivity labels, you've got the ability to, I think this is really cool, you've got the ability to effectively prevent people from sharing content inside teams. So let me try and explain. Imagine you're on a video call and you start sharing a file. If you happen to pick a file in that video call that is sensitive and there's people on that call that should not have access to that file, it won't allow you to screen share a sensitive file. I think this is brilliant. You know, effectively what you're doing here is, even if you share it, by the way, not just the file itself, if you share it as part of your screen, so if you're sharing your whole screen and just try and get the file in, Teams is aware that that file is sensitive and that person shouldn't see it. So there's some really cool things you can do with these features if you actually invest in them and take a bit of time to actually look at what they can do. It does take a bit of legwork to get this all set up. So guess how are we doing? 36 minutes in. Let's start concluding a little bit. I guess the way that many organizations use Teams is almost out of the box. And I just want to show you what the architecture of Teams looks like without any governance at all, without any controls, without any thinking. You create some teams and they're just sort of stored. And obviously, as we've seen, your teams come with SharePoint sites. And there's no architecture, there's no real logic. It's just flat. They're just added as needed. And here's a team you can see with some private channels. So there's more than one SharePoint site being created. And yes, you can see here there's teams and SharePoint sites that belong to certain parts of the organization. But you can't see that until you actually open them up and look at who is the owner. So from a bird's eye view, if you're working in compliance or if you're in IT trying to actually work out who owns what and which of these things has value, it's incredibly difficult if you do nothing, if you just go with the flow of the out-of-the-box product, to really have a clue where the value lies and how different things should be managed and retained appropriately. So this leads, as you can imagine, to a whole wealth of different problems. I'm not going to read this list out. I think many of these are very obvious, very sensible, but you know, doing nothing really, to me, doesn't appear to be a valid option when it comes to Microsoft Teams. You're just making a big mess, a bit like doing nothing with a file share in terms of managing its structure. Almost this is worse because there's no starting structure. It's like a non-hierarchical file share where stuff's all over the place. And the longer you do nothing, the harder it becomes to rectify. So what do you do? Well, I would suggest that organizations, as soon as they possibly can, I recognize it's very difficult over the last couple of months especially to do this, but stop allowing people to create new teams and SharePoint sites out of the box if you're still allowing them to. Turn off self-service creation of teams and SharePoint and groups, simply because you've got to get in ahead of that curve as soon as you can. You need to replace this with a process for requesting new workspaces, for approving new workspaces, and for creating those workspaces before they're pushed out. And what I really mean by this is this process here could be entirely manual. You know, a small organization, this could be a ticket or an email that's sent through, gets an approval from a line manager and is created by the IT team or something. Perhaps the IT team have different types of, you know, teams that they're spinning up, and some of them they add different tabs or different retention to. But for a large organization, certainly when you're in thousands of users, the only sensible way of doing this really is through an automated process to capture the requests, to, you know, undertake the workflow that's behind the approval, and then you can have automated provisioning behind the scenes that will create all of these SharePoint sites and all of the teams from templates. So you're almost giving them the starting structure you need, giving them all of the metadata, giving them the naming conventions that you need to get in there. And of course, the result is, from a SharePoint perspective, your sites could potentially be automatically added to hubs, let's say. You can see that potentially the architecture you get out of this is more consistent, better named, and easier to manage down the line. From a Teams perspective, again, you've got the consistent naming, and hopefully you've got different types of templates so you can easily say, oh, that's a project, oh, that's a major policy. And you can start then applying different amounts of retention or different sensitivity, let's say, to different parts of your environment, depending upon the context of what type of information people are creating and using in those spaces. So I guess I'm going to start wrapping up here, but I guess the point I'm trying to get to is there's a philosophical question in the back of my mind, I guess, about the usage of teams, because they're both, so I speak to different organizations all the time, and I'm seeing sort of two views of what a team is. Many organizations see teams as a very temporary thing, that they are projects, that they effectively are only for the short-term collaboration and should expire. And I'm not saying either of these is right or wrong, by the way, but you know, they should have a very known endpoint and they should expire pretty soon. Another view is, and I think this is great too, is that actually, why should perpetual business units, you know, departments, let's say, why should they not be able to take advantage of having a wall and a chat and all the other functionality that comes in Teams? Why should that just be the preserve of the temporary team? I guess, especially when you start thinking about archival and retention, you start thinking about this as a concept. If you've got temporary teams, then obviously they need to have a life cycle. When you're taking that content at the end of that life cycle, you know, are you locking down each team in situ, almost as, oh, that project's closed, let's lock this down and let's retain this now in situ? Or, you know, if you're also including permanent concepts of teams, it becomes harder to lock them all down because they keep churning. So perhaps we're in a situation where there needs to be some consideration again about, if teams are being closed towards the end of the life cycle, are we going to be moving content outside of the situ, you know, the context that it was created in the team, into perhaps more permanent structures for information management? Or is it better to keep the content locked down almost in situ perpetually? And I don't have a good answer. I can argue this both ways very easily. I think it really will depend upon the specific needs of an organization. So I'm sure I've probably raised as many questions as I keep hearing beeping in the background. I don't know if everyone else is, but I'm assuming it's just me. I'm assuming if I turn onto the questions tab, there'll be an absolute load of questions in there already, which I haven't been paying attention to at all.
Oh, hi, Rob. That was fabulous as always. Thank you for that. Really great stuff. What we have actually in the questions tab is, I think I've calculated, I think there's about 12 questions on there.
Okay.
I don't know, should we perhaps just take them in the order that they appeared? Is that okay with you?
Yes, certainly. Which one we got? Bottom first, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've got about 12 on there. Yeah.
That's pretty
Thank
good.
you, people, for contributing. That's great. There's a few where at the very beginning there were technical questions about getting on the webinar and what have you. But then the first question that I thought was definitely one for you, Rob, was a question from Zoe Cooper. If you can see it from 17 minutes ago. And Zoe asks, can you auto-archive teams which are inactive? Oh, basically just checking the total details of the question there. Can you see that there, Rob, on the questions tab?
Yes, I can. I'll be honest, Zoe, I don't know for sure. So I'll get back to you on that one, but you can certainly auto-expire teams. It wouldn't surprise me if you can auto-archive them as well after, let's say, 3 months inactive. Certainly I've seen my own teams disappear and go into hidden, but I'll get back to you on that one with an actual technical response.
Thanks for that, Rob. Brilliant. The next one, we've got one from Mike. Mike notes that he's been told today that chat's minimum retention is going from 3 days to 1 day, and he wonders if that's correct.
Again, I've not looked at that one. So consulting answer, let me look it up for you and actually check this out. It could well be the case. I mean, minimum retentions are, I guess it depends what you're using it for, but most organizations are not typically, in my experience, looking at really low levels of retention. They're looking at the other extreme. It sounds like you're an interesting business case there anyway. Quite interesting to know what you're doing with it. I'll find that out for you.
Oh, marvellous, Rob. Thank you for that. There's a good question from Victoria here. She's asking if there's any advice for FOI and DS rights in terms of the chat post history. That's a good one, isn't it? Because it's like, how long do we retain these things to ensure that we're in line with FOI and information requests and all the rest of it. So that's a beaut, that one, Victoria.
Yeah, quite. I mean, obviously you need to be compliant, so you need to make sure that the information's retained for as long as you need it to be. The best tool that you've got available to you is effectively content search in the Compliance Centre. And content search really has been designed for subject access requests, but it allows you to query across all of your content in Office 365 and start finding, well, I say all, I think it's certainly most of the content in in Microsoft 365, and start finding sort of individuals, let's say, that are named in certain locations, and that does include the chats and the posts. So certainly, so long as you've managed to keep that content and retain it, it's searchable, and then you can export it from content search as needed. So I think that helps you to at least, well, it's certainly better than in the past where there'll be lots of different communications going on. It certainly, I think, it helps organisations to better manage that. Any other questions?
Oh, we've got one next from Richard, and Richard asks, does defaulting labels require an E5 license?
Good question. Good question. And the answer is no one really knows.
I love it.
So I've had this in written confirmation to a UK ministerial department. No, it doesn't, from Microsoft. At the same time, there's a lady called, I think, Joanne Klein, who spoke in November at Microsoft's conference over in the States, who said definitively, yes, it does. And on her blog post, she's effectively saying that passing all of the questions to Microsoft's licensing team. So when I was over in Seattle back in January, I went to Redmond and I was speaking to people in the compliance team over there in Microsoft, and I raised this question, and they looked a bit sheepish. They didn't give me an answer. And I also commented on one of their blog posts recently about the release of the new records management features inside Microsoft 365. And again, they've deliberately not responded to me. I get the impression that there is, off the record, that there is almost a pressure in Microsoft. I think they always intended the default labeling to be an E5 premium feature, and never had a way of controlling that. And now lots of organizations with lower level licenses are using it, and Microsoft's almost in a debate with itself. I might be paraphrasing. I do hope people correct me if I'm wrong here, but I get the impression there might be a debate going on amongst themselves as to whether they can afford to up license that or not, and how many people will it annoy. I don't know is the only answer to that question. I really am trying to encourage them not to increase that license up to an E5, because I think that'd be critical.
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? Thank you for that, Rob. That's useful to know. We've got the next question, which Zoe is asking about what other organisations are doing in terms of manual labelling of files from Teams, because it's quite a big bucket approach, isn't it? There's so much information out there. And I was wondering perhaps that's something I could ask of the group via email. It's quite a broad question, but I was going to ask you, Rob, if there's anything you've come across in your experience of how organisations have approached that. Not a big question, but perhaps maybe an organisation that you know where it's perhaps worked well.
So, I think manual labelling rarely works as the only strategy. And the reason I say that is I've never met anyone who gets excited about labeling their content and tagging it. I think it might work in organizations with small numbers of very highly skilled and trained staff. So, you know, if you had a small scientific research laboratory or something, you might well be able to get away with manual labeling simply because you know, you can actually get people to understand the value of what they're doing when they're applying the label. But for most organizations, I think people hate metadata. They love it when it's there to help them recover the information. They absolutely hate tagging stuff. So personally, I find that you need to have a different mechanism for getting the label on. And I think the default values that we're just talking about and hoping the license doesn't go up to E5, that default values are set on the folders and libraries really gives you a nice balance, because you can almost set the default label and then manually label the exception. So people typically will just leave the label that's applied by the folder unless they think, no, that's the wrong thing, and change it. And that balance, it's not perfect, I know, but it's probably closer to the best solution I've seen applied, and probably gets you up to, I don't know, 70 or 80% correctly labeled content with minimal effort for your staff. So that's my preferred strategy.
I think that sounds sensible, Rob, because from my point of view, organisations I've worked in organisations with many members of staff, thousands of staff, and there's no way that you're going to get them to manually label things. So you're right, I think default is the way to go, with the exception, as you mentioned. Yeah, that sounds sensible. Zoe, what I can do is I'll get in touch with you after the webinar, and if you'd like to kind of maybe we can post it out to see what other organisations, if people are willing to share, what's happened to them in the past. I think it's useful to know, isn't it? Right. I think we've got about 3 questions left. Is that okay with you, Rob?
Yeah, I'll keep going.
Excellent. So Catherine has a question here. Any advice or good practice for organisations with pre-established SharePoint architecture, so transferring Teams content to existing SharePoint after such and such a time, that type of thing? Or most people leave Teams content in place for its whole retention period?
I guess this is what I was saying as I was wrapping up. I can argue this both ways. I've not seen a perfect solution because, of course, if you move the content away from where it was created, you lose the context of the content. But at the same time, let's say you've got a project. Very often the important outputs of the project are a couple of reports. You don't necessarily need all of the drafts. But would I say that if the project was, I don't know, Picasso painting, and you wouldn't chuck away all those drafts paintings, would you? So I think it really depends upon what you're looking at and the value of the information that you're actually managing in each space. From an information recovery perspective, when you're, as a user, if I'm coming back later to find the relevant version of the information, I personally think that if all of the relevant files are stored in different projects and different teams all over the place, they're effectively being siloed away from much of the organization. So moving almost as a publication into a central space does have a lot of merit for helping people in the future operation, but it's a balance. It really depends on your organization and the type of information you're managing, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. It does depend on what the actual content is, doesn't it? It's a bit of a either or question, isn't it? Yeah. I think that the next question from Lisa is along similar lines, where Lisa's asking, how are people managing the dual environment aspect when some people are using 365 and some are not? It's quite a similar question to Catherine's there, I think, where it is that difficult, isn't it, where you have some people still on the old system, some people using Teams, and it is quite a painful process, isn't it, trying to get people to change from what they're used to doing to a new environment?
Oh gosh, yes. It's always difficult when you're in flux between places, and the problem is that you end up with this growth of different IT solutions, and honestly, if you can streamline into as few as possible that work for people, I think you're in a better place. So the faster you can transition fully, the better you are. Otherwise, you'll find, drop boxes and boxes and all sorts of different sharing solutions appearing all over the place with less and less control. So I personally think I recognize the pain. You almost need to try and minimize how many different solutions you have and try and get the transition into 365 running as fast as you can. But at the same time, recognize that getting some of these controls, especially provisioning and getting retention applied to all of the correct structures inside Office 365 really should happen as fast as you can as well before you really start letting people loose on it. So really difficult balancing act that I think many companies and organizations are facing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll thank you for that, and we'll make sure that we obviously send this recording out so people can see the responses to your questions, to the questions, Rob. Our next one is from Kevin Mears. Bear with me, I'm just my chat is just deciding to play about. Oh, I've got it back. Kevin's asking, how do we manage the challenge of improving people's digital skills if we don't allow them to experiment with the technology? That's a good one, because I think that's where people are resistant, isn't it? Where they feel uncomfortable with new tech. So I guess will it all be about obviously the training?
Well, yeah, I mean, on a personal note, to respond to you, Kevin, I personally find that I don't learn anything until I hit a wall myself and actually have to face a challenge. So if I bang my head against it and actually face the challenge myself, I tend to learn a lot better than if I'm picking up a book or a training guide or anything like that, or even if I'm in a training seminar. But at the same time, I think getting people's digital skills up to scratch. Office 365 looks more complicated than it is. And I think once people start becoming familiar with certain skills and certain places, certainly Teams is actually relatively intuitive. It's really quite streamlined compared to, let's say, SharePoint. That's not to say there aren't hard edges that people quickly encounter. I would suggest that it's going to have to be a combined approach. You need to have a plan for user adoption in your organization that's going to include some form of training, some form of perpetual training as well, not just in one-off training, but guides that people can refer to. And when I say guides, people don't want to pick up the 30,000 word documents anymore. They're really after 2-minute, 3-minute soundbite videos. I think they're much more effective, especially if it's a new member of staff in 2 years' time, keeping up to date. The downside, of course, is that Office 365, or should I say Microsoft 365 now, changes so frequently that it's really difficult to keep any form of training collateral up to date. But it's a balance. It can't all be training collateral. You've just got to let people make a mess and play to a certain extent as well.
I think you're right. I think I know myself personally, again, it's sometimes a personal view, isn't it? But I know I'm like that. I think I prefer to just get in there and try it. And I think I could go to as many training sessions as possible, but until I actually get my hands on it and try it, I think that's the way I learn best as well. But as you rightly say, other people learn different ways, so it is a bit of a trick, isn't it? Yeah. What I thought was we have 3 minutes left, so I thought we could take the next question from Alison, and then the remaining questions, which I think we've got about 4 or 5 questions that unfortunately we won't get to, but Scott has very kindly made a record of those, and if we can get back to you, Rob, and do that blog that you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
And if anyone's got any question, they can reach out to me at any time. My email address is on the screen there. Off the record, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have about any subject.
Oh, thank you so much, Rob. That's great. I mean, that's great for members on the call to know. So brilliant. I've got a last question here from Alison, and I think, Alison, this is true of many organisations, so don't feel alone in this. Alison's saying she's new to Office 365 and SharePoint, and trying to understand the relationship between existing SharePoint and Teams is quite difficult, and it is, isn't it? So I guess it's kind of, what is that relationship? How does Teams interact with SharePoint is the question, I feel. I've got that right, Alison? Yeah,
so it's really in the files. Teams, as I was trying to explain, is this amalgamation of different parts of Microsoft 365 that's being drawn into a single interface. But it's really, the SharePoint components are the files. So the way to think about this is when you create a team, behind that team is a SharePoint site where the files are actually being stored. Teams is just showing you those files that are really in SharePoint. SharePoint is effectively just being allowing the people who are members of the team to have access to those files. And you can actually browse from the team straight into the SharePoint site and start using it and seeing it. So I guess it might be easier to try and explain it as it's the storage location for the files behind the team. But it doesn't replace SharePoint. SharePoint itself has huge amount of application when it comes to building business application, extending workflows, etc., that some of which you cannot do yet in Teams.
Right, that's really useful. Thank you, Rob. That's great. Can I just say on behalf of us all, that was so useful. Thank you for your time, Rob, in doing that presentation.
Right.
Very useful indeed. Just to let everyone know as well, we've recorded this session, so we'll be making this available probably in the next couple of weeks or so, because we'll need to make sure it's all ready to go up on the website. And if anyone has any queries, you heard Rob there very kindly say that you could contact him. But of course, you can contact us at the IRMS as well if you have any queries there. We'll put together a blog post for the remaining questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to. But clearly, there's been a lot of interest on this call. So thank you very much for attending. We really do appreciate it. And thanks again to Rob for being a bit of a star. Thank you all, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. The sun is shining. So I hope you can get out in the garden, perhaps. Take care. Bye.
Cheers all.